So back in 1945, there was this incredibly brilliant mathematician, John von Neumann, and he was staring down the reality of the atomic bomb, the one he was actively helping to build.
Like the Manhattan Project.
Exactly. And he made this genuinely chilling observation. He basically said, what we are creating right now is a monster whose influence is going to change history, provided there is any history left.
Yeah, that's a heavy quote. But, the really unsettling part of what he said wasn't actually the warning itself. It was his conclusion.
Right, because he argued that it would be, like, absolutely impossible not to see the project through.
Exactly. He felt it would be a violation of scientific duty to just walk away from what was technically feasible, completely regardless of the catastrophic consequences.
Mm.
And, well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that exact same psychological paradox is playing out right now.
Yeah.
Only today, it's applied to the modern race to build artificial superintelligence.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. We are taking you on a deep dive into that very paradox. We've got a great stack of sources today, mainly extensive excerpts from Sebastian Mallaby's book, The Infinity Machine, along with some pretty provocative anonymous quotes from researchers.
Yeah, researchers who are talking about the alien logic of the systems they're actively building.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you look at the people building these systems, you start to ask, why do the brilliant scientists who predict AI might literally cause the end of human history just keep building it anyway?
It's the ultimate question.
Mm.
And to understand this push toward an infinity machine, which is basically a machine capable of understanding reality better than we do, we have to look at the specific mind leading the charge.
Demis Hassabis.
Right, the driving force behind DeepMind. Because you don't just accidentally build an infinity machine without a very specific, almost, messianic type of personality.
Definitely. And his childhood reads less like a standard Silicon Valley tech biography and more like an intense psychological thriller.
It really does. He grew up in this working-class melting pot in North London.
Yeah, his mother was a Chinese Singaporean orphan who moved to the UK, and his father was this Greek Cypriot bohemian.
Right, and the dad made a living selling toys out of the back of this beaten-up red Volkswagen van.
Yeah.
It was a pretty chaotic, poverty-adjacent environment.
But amidst all that chaos, Demis just had this intellect that was, well, it was simply anomalous. I mean, by the time he was 4 years old, he's watching his father play chess, and he just deduces the rules purely through observation.
Which is wild. And by age 6, he isn't just playing casually. He is actively destroying adult opponents in national tournaments.
Yeah, there's this crazy moment with Leonard Barden, right?
Oh, yeah. Barton was essentially the patriarch of the English chess scene at the time. He actually pulled Demis's father aside and flat out told him, "Your son is the best 6-year-old I have ever seen."
That was huge.
It was. That single sentence completely rewired the family's entire existence.
Mm-hmm.
The father just became utterly fixated on nurturing this prodigy.
Which, sounds like the setup for a heartwarming sports movie, right? But the reality was an absolute pressure cooker for this kid.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they didn't have money for hotels.
Right. So the dad would bundle Demis into that red VW van, drive all across the country to these drab, freezing church halls for tournaments.
And they would sleep in sleeping bags laid directly over the engine block in the back of the van just to capture the residual heat so they wouldn't freeze.
Just brutal. And the psychological toll was even heavier than the physical stuff, because Demis rarely lost, but when he actually did drop a match, his father would just completely lose control.
Yeah, he would throw these massive, explosive, screaming tantrums.
And then later on, the father would try to sort of walk it back, right? He'd try to soften the intensity with that classic cliche parent line, "It doesn't matter if you win or lose, as long as you do your best."
Which is such a dangerous thing to say to a hyper-analytical child prodigy who just survived a screaming fit.
Exactly. The interpretation gets wildly distorted. Demis didn't hear, "Oh, just give it a good try." He internalized this completely twisted definition of effort.
Right. He concluded that trying your best literally meant pushing your biological limits until you were on the verge of physical collapse.
Let me give you an analogy for how intense this mindset actually is. Imagine a normal person running a marathon. For them, the goal is to pace yourself, cross the finish line, get your little medal, and, maybe eat a banana.
Sure, sounds nice.
But for Demis, the goal of the marathon would be to run so violently hard that you deliberately end up in the medical tent on an IV drip. Because if you cross that finish line and you were still standing well, it means you held a reserve of energy back.
Right. I mean, you didn't actually give 100%.
Exactly. So I ask you, the listener, how many of us could survive operating at that kind of redline capacity all day, every day?
Basically nobody. But it completely shapes his worldview. And it's really no coincidence that during this formative period, Demis discovered the sci-fi novel Ender's Game.
Oh man, that is such a perfect parallel.
It is. If you're unfamiliar, the book is about this diminutive, socially isolated boy genius who gets manipulated by adults.
Hmm.
And he's burdened with this ultimate terrifying task of saving the human race from an alien threat.
Right, and Ender is a character who is willing to absolutely break himself mentally, physically, just to fulfill that mission.
Exactly. And Demis deeply identified with that. He saw himself as this gifted kid who was basically sacrificing his own childhood because the responsibility to achieve something massive was just too great to ignore.
But, I mean, a human brain can only redline like that for so long before something has to snap.
Yeah, and for Demis, that breaking point, or really his massive epiphany, happens when he's 12 years old.
Right, at that tournament near Liechtenstein.
Yes. He's competing in this grueling chess tournament. He gets matched against an older German master, this guy who is just aggressively chain-smoking through the entire game.
In a closed room, mind you.
Right. And this match drags on for an agonizing 10 hours.
10 hours. For a 12-year-old kid, that is pure, relentless mental calculus.
Then eventually exhaustion takes over. Demis slips up, makes a mistake, gets trapped, and he has to capitulate. He loses.
But the reaction from the German master is what makes this such a core memory, right?
Yeah, it's awful. The man immediately jumps up, gloats, and excitedly starts demonstrating to the room how Demis could have actually forced a stalemate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the man's friends all gather around the table, jeering and laughing at this completely exhausted 12-year-old kid.
That is just deeply psychologically brutal.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it forces a total recalibration in his mind.
Right.
The next morning, Demis looks around that tournament hall. He sees all these brilliant, high IQ individuals dueling over a wooden board until they're completely drained.
Right.
And he realizes that spending this magnitude of collective human brain power on a game with artificial constraints is just a tragic, monumental waste of human potential.
Wow.
Yeah. He decides in that moment that this kind of mental effort has to be harnessed for something real, like science or medicine. He literally walks away from a future as a professional chess player.
But here is the fascinating pivot. I mean, he has this grand realization that he needs to tackle science, but he is still only a teenager.
Right, you can't just walk into a cancer research lab at 12 years old and ask for a job.
Exactly. But he still loves the architecture of systems,
Yeah.
the way rules interact to create outcomes. So he ends up channeling that intense, calculating brain into the closest interactive medium available to a kid in the early 90s, which was video games.
Yes.
And this accidental detour into gaming is what ultimately shatters the scientific community's totally flawed approach to artificial intelligence.
It really is a massive turning point in the history of AI, because at age 15, Demis enters a competition for the legendary video game studio Bullfrog.
Oh, I remember Bullfrog.
Yeah, and he catches the eye of the founder, Peter Molyneux, who was this sort of erratic, brilliant savant of the gaming industry. Demis actually impressed him by designing a chess variant of the arcade game Space Invaders.
Which is such a Demis thing to do.
Right, so Molyneux brings Demis in, and soon this teenager becomes the lead programmer for a wildly ambitious game called Theme Park.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second because we really need to contrast what was happening in academia at this time versus what Demis was doing at Bullfrog, because the difference is wild.
Oh, it's night and day.
At elite universities, these highly paid academic AI professors were building incredibly primitive, boring simulations. They would literally have these geometric blobs on a screen labeled like bear, dog, and mouse, and they'd program basic rules for them to chase each other.
Right, very rigid.
Meanwhile, you have teenage Demis building this immensely complex, cascading digital ecosystem. In Theme Park, the digital guests walking around the park didn't just follow a set path. They had rich, simulated internal states.
Exactly. He was programming emergent behavior. For instance, if you, as the human player playing the game, decided to put too much salt on the virtual French fries being sold at a concession stand.
Which you could do.
Yeah. The digital guests would have a hidden thirst variable that would increase. And once that variable crossed a certain threshold, they would actively break their path and seek out sodas to buy.
That's amazing.
Or if you built a roller coaster with physics that went too fast, the guests' nausea metrics would spike and they would literally vomit on the digital pavement.
So good.
He wasn't just programming simple if A then B commands. He was building a reactive, messy, nuanced world.
And he was so phenomenally good at this that when he finally decided to leave the studio at age 18 to go study at Cambridge, Peter Molyneux desperately tried to bribe him to stay.
Oh, yeah?
He handed this 18-year-old kid a check for £500,000, £500,000.
Just to stay and make video games?
Right. But Demis walked away because that Ender's Game Drive was calling him. He wanted to understand the fundamental nature of intelligence itself.
But then he gets to Cambridge.
Yeah, she gets to Cambridge, and he slams face first into a massive ideological brick wall in the computer science department. The sources refer to it as symbolic AI.
Yeah, to understand why the entire field of AI had been stagnant for decades, we have to look at the foundational ideology that emerged from the 1950s Dartmouth Conference.
Right.
The pioneers of computer science back then believed deeply in rigid logic. Their core assumption was that all human intelligence was essentially deductive and rational.
Okay.
Therefore, if you wanted to build an artificial brain, you just needed to translate the real world into mathematical syllogisms and hard-coded rules.
Which, sounds perfectly logical on paper until you actually try to build it.
Right.
The sources bring up the Psych Project, which was basically the absolute peak of this hubris. They literally tried to hard-code human common sense by writing millions of individual rules into a database.
It was a massive undertaking.
Yeah, they had to manually program statements like, you cannot be in two places at the same time, or cups must be held open-end up if they have liquid in them.
And that approach just completely shatters when it encounters what philosophers call the categorization problem.
Right, explain that.
Well, symbolic AI requires unambiguous truths. Imagine trying to teach a rule-based computer how to categorize objects. You can write a line of code that says, a butter knife and a carving knife belong in the same category because they share a specific function, which is cutting.
Okay, sure. That makes mathematical sense.
But then how do you teach that exact same computer that a dachshund and a golden retriever belong in the same category?
Right, because they look totally different in size and shape.
Exactly.
Right.
And they do not share a utilitarian function like a knife does.
Right, they are categorized together because they are the same species. But how do you write a math equation for species?
You really can't. A biologist would categorize them together because they can theoretically mate and produce fertile offspring. So now you are asking a programmer to write a rule that tells the AI when to categorize objects by visual appearance, when to categorize by human utility, and when to categorize by reproductive potential.
It's just too much.
Yeah, you cannot write a rule for every single contextual exception in the universe. It is an impossible task.
Here's where it gets really interesting and why the old academic approach was just fundamentally doomed. Human reality is simply too messy for first-order logic.
It is.
Think of symbolic AI like trying to write a step-by-step mathematical instruction manual for falling in love.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, you can't write a script that says, if person A makes eye contact for 3.5 seconds and person B smiles at a 45-degree angle, then initiates romance protocol.
Right, that's absurd.
It is absurd. Humans don't learn by memorizing a million rigid rules. We learn by absorbing massive amounts of messy, unstructured data sites, smells, social cues, and intuitively recognizing patterns. That process is called induction. And the 50-year-old academic model of symbolic AI just could not handle induction. So if we don't think in math equations, why did we spend 50 years trying to make computers think that way?
And this brings us to a really profound turning point. Hassabis and his close friend at Cambridge, David Silver, realized that if humans cannot hard code this messy intuition into a machine, they had to completely redefine the fundamental purpose of a computer.
Yeah.
They started holding these deep philosophical debates with a Cambridge professor named John Dogman.
The Nirvana sessions.
They jokingly called them the Nirvana sessions.
Yeah.
And Dogman introduced a concept that completely shattered their previous worldview. He taught them that matter and energy are actually not the fundamental building blocks of the universe.
Okay.
Information is.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the scale of this paradigm shift.
Yeah.
You're saying that the genetic code in our DNA, the physics governing a black hole, the chemical reactions of a star, it all basically boils down to information processing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And if information is the fundamental unit of reality, then the ultimate tool for understanding the universe isn't a massive telescope or a multi-billion-dollar particle accelerator.
It's a computer.
It's a computer, but it cannot be a traditional computer. This is exactly what that anonymous quote from our sources was pointing to when it said, "We are looking at something that looks like a machine, but it contains a logic that exists in a dimension we are only just beginning to understand."
That sounds incredibly sci-fi, but it is the actual blueprint for what DeepMind set out to build.
Exactly. During those Nirvana sessions, they conceptualized a 3-level leap in how reality is processed.
Hmm.
Level 1 is the raw information itself, the physics, the biology, the raw data of the universe.
Yeah.
Level 2 is human design computation. These are computers we use every day, where a human programmer writes the rules and the machine just executes them blindly.
Right, the symbolic AI stuff.
Yes. But level 3, the absolute holy grail of artificial intelligence, is building a machine capable of figuring out how to design its own computation. Because we don't know how to write the code for intuition or induction, we have to build a system that can teach itself how to learn.
Let's break down the actual mechanism here, because
Yeah.
this is where a house analogy perfectly illustrates the terror and the beauty of this leap.
Let's hear it.
The old way, symbolic AI, was like humans drawing a highly detailed blueprint for a house and then handing a robot an instruction manual on exactly where to place every single brick.
Right.
The new way, level 3 AI, completely abandons the blueprint. It is like building a robot, locking it in an empty room, and telling it to invent the very concept of architecture from scratch. So listener, can you see why this is both thrilling and slightly terrifying?
It is terrifying. And the how of that process is what makes it so revolutionary.
Yeah.
They use a mechanism called reinforcement learning.
Right.
Instead of giving the machine rules, you give it a goal, for example, maximize the score in a game, then you just let it loose to try completely random actions. In the first few seconds, it fails miserably.
Of course.
But because it is a computer, it is failing millions of times a second. Every single time it accidentally performs an action that gets it infinitesimally closer to the goal, the system reinforces that mathematical pathway.
Right. It plays against itself.
Exactly, continuously mutating and evolving its own internal logic until it discovers strategies that a human mind would never even conceive.
Which completely flips the script on what software is supposed to be. I mean, Hassabis isn't trying to build a better algorithm to serve you personalized ads or a new smartphone app.
No, not at all.
He views this level 3 AI as a tool for ultimate scientific enlightenment. He literally wants to use it as a lens to solve the foundational mysteries of physics that frustrated Albert Einstein and Richard Feynman.
And the shocking part is, this self-learning approach is actually working.
It is.
In 2016, DeepMind's AI used reinforcement learning to solve the ancient game of Go, defeating the human world champion in a game that relies almost entirely on intuition.
But the true validation of his vision came in 2020, right? When DeepMind tackled the grand challenge of protein folding.
Yes. To understand the gravity of this, proteins are the microscopic machinery of life, and their function is entirely dictated by how they fold into complex three-dimensional shapes.
Okay.
For 50 years, biologists struggled to predict these shapes because the mathematical possibilities for how a protein can fold are actually greater than the number of atoms in the observable universe.
That is staggering.
And DeepMind's AlphaFold system didn't just guess it, it learned the underlying patterns of biology and successfully predicted the structures of nearly every protein known to science.
Which is a breakthrough so monumental it recently won a Nobel Prize. We are talking about accelerating the discovery of new drugs, understanding diseases like Alzheimer's at a structural level, and even engineering enzymes that can consume plastic pollution.
It's incredible.
It is an incredible triumph of the human intellect. But, and this brings us back to the von Neumann quote we started with, this is also the terrifying paradox at the heart of our deep dive.
Yes, it is.
Building an infinity machine that can decode and manipulate reality is the ultimate scientific achievement. But bringing that omnipotent tool into our highly volatile, deeply flawed human society creates a massive, frightening clash between scientific purity and human destruction.
It does, and you actually see that tension in Hassabis himself. The sources note that he works these brutal nocturnal shifts from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. on top of his regular day job as a CEO.
Wow.
He does this because he feels like reality is, quote, literally screaming at me to uncover its mysteries. His motive is remarkably pure. He wants to understand time, gravity, the universe. He wants to read the mind of God, essentially, before his time on Earth is up.
Yet he isn't blind to the doom scenarios. DeepMind's own researchers are acutely aware of the existential risks.
Right.
And we aren't just talking about economic shifts or job losses. We are talking about deepfakes utterly destroying the concept of objective truth, the creation of terrifying autonomous weapons systems, and the extreme sci-fi scenario where silicon intelligence simply decides to eradicate flesh and blood intelligence.
It's all on the table.
So why build it?
Yeah.
Why keep pushing the boulder up the hill if you know it might crush you on the way down? The text gives us two competing explanations for the psychology of these scientists.
Right. The first is what the text frames as the generous explanation, championed by tech optimists like the investor Reid Hoffman.
Okay.
The core argument here is that inventing is intrinsic to the human condition. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." And Hoffman adapts that to, "I invent, therefore I am."
Oh, interesting.
This philosophy insists that humanity will naturally rise to the occasion and manage the risks, and that the ultimate upside, curing all diseases, stabilizing the climate, creating boundless clean energy, is a moral imperative we just cannot ignore.
But then there's the troubling explanation, the Icarus instinct.
Yes.
And this is perfectly captured by Geoffrey Hinton, who is widely considered one of the academic godfathers of modern AI. The sources highlight a private conversation from 2015 between Hinton and the philosopher Nick Bostrom.
That conversation is chilling.
It is. Hinton flat out admitted that once artificial superintelligence actually works, political systems and bad actors will inevitably abuse it to terrorize people. It is a certainty in his mind.
And when Bostrom challenged him, asking the obvious question, then why are you doing the research? Why are you building it?
Yeah.
Hinton's response was, well, it was telling. He said, I could give you the usual arguments, but the truth is that the prospect of discovery is too sweet.
Too sweet.
Yeah, and he was directly echoing J. Robert Oppenheimer's justification for building the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer argued that when a scientist sees a technical puzzle that is technically sweet, the overwhelming urge to solve it completely overrides the moral calculation of what happens after it is solved.
So what does this all actually mean? I have to push back on this sweetness argument.
Yep.
Because calling the prospect of discovery too sweet sounds like a very poetic, beautifully phrased cop-out for incredibly brilliant people who simply lack the self-control to stop opening Pandora's box.
That's a fair criticism.
It's like they are addicted to the puzzle itself, regardless of the fallout. Now, to be fair to Demis Hassabis, the sources make it explicitly clear that he is not some greedy Silicon Valley egomaniac chasing a stock price.
Oh, no, not at all.
He is consistently described as a decent, public-spirited individual genuinely aiming for scientific enlightenment. He truly wants to elevate humanity.
He absolutely wants to do good, but the text soberingly points out that Oppenheimer was also a genius who wanted to do good.
Oh.
He wanted to end a devastating global war. But once he solved the puzzle and built the bomb, he completely lost control over how it was utilized by the military and political apparatus.
Yeah.
That is the tragic historical precedent of the inventor.
Yeah.
You can possess the purest intentions in the world, but once the infinity machine exists, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the world.
It really is a heavy, monumental concept to sit with. To summarize the journey we've been on today, we started by looking at a young kid who was pushed to the absolute psychological brink in the freezing halls of chess tournaments, internalizing a grueling red-line definition of effort.
Right.
We watched him take that obsessive Ender's Game drive into the world of video games, where he accidentally dismantled the flawed, rigid logic of 1950s computer science. And now, armed with the realization that information is the bedrock of reality, he is attempting to birth a self-learning machine that can decipher the ultimate source code of the universe.
Which leaves us with a lingering, almost philosophical question for you to consider. We've spent this time exploring the relentless human drive to invent and discover. If Hassabis succeeds, if his infinity machine actually delivers all the answers to physics, biology, and the universe, effectively solving every puzzle humanity has ever faced, what happens to the human spirit?
Yeah.
If a machine is doing all of our thinking, all of our discovering, and all of our inventing for us, do we risk losing that very drive that made us human in the first place?
Wow. That is definitely something to chew on. Keep questioning, keep exploring the boundaries of what you know, and mull that over until your next deep dive.